So let's talk about the Israeli-Iran war from my own African perspective as a former international relations student and a keen follower of geopolitics. It's the year 2011. I've just joined college to do my undergrad in international relations and diplomacy. And 2011, if most of you can remember, is the year of the Arab uprising. So I think it had started in Tunisia on the 27th of December 2010, I think, with Mohamed Bouazizi self-immolating, burning himself up in a market because Abedin Ben Ali's policemen had come hard on him. I don't know, they wanted a bribe or something of the sort. It sets off a chain of events, and the following year, so I think a couple of days into the new year, we are having uprisings in Egypt, Tahrir Square, in Syria, in Yemen, I think even in Bahrain for a particular period of time. And this is the year I start my undergrad. And very quickly, having been a keen student of history and always reading a lot of historical books and events and everything, foreign policy and geopolitics comes to the fore. And we are learning about the Middle East, the wars that were taking place over there, why it's always a very volatile region. And a good friend of mine, Albert, he comes up with information about some guy called A.Q. Khan. So if any of you know A.Q. Khan, the Pakistani centrifuges and some nuclear technology and brought it to Iran. It's also the same time we are talking with him and other of my classmates at the time, we are freshers. And he mentioned stuff like Stuxnet and Duku. For those who might not be in the know, Stuxnet and Duku, these were cyber malware which were implanted by a joint NSA and Unit 8200 of the Israeli military intel. They planted them inside, I think, Natanz and maybe in one of the other nuclear facilities in Iran, which have been bombed over the past 1 week. And so with the ongoing Arab uprising in so many of these countries, Syria becomes one of the most violent ones, of course, alongside Libya. But in Libya, you have the responsibility to protect, which quickly changes in a matter of weeks into a regime change. The same regime change we are seeing with Iran and the Israeli leadership, especially Benjamin Netanyahu, or by his real name, Milekoski, and the defense minister, Israel Katz, all talking about we need to take out the Iranian supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and the American president weighing in, Donald Trump, and saying, yeah, we know where he is, he's posting on Truth Social, we know his location, he's very safe at the moment, we won't take him out, not now, in brackets and stuff like that. So regime changes in the air back in 2011, and for Syria, I remember debating with one of my classmates at the time. He was like, yeah, the West will do the same thing they did in Libya, in Syria. And at the time I was like, no way they will pull that off. Because I think in winter, Syria was the only host of a warm water port for the Russian Navy in Latakia. And so the idea at the time is like outside of, and that also probably brings Crimea, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, into sharp focus with this particular historical journey. And so I'm like, yeah, the West, what they have achieved in Libya, they will not manage it in Syria. But back to the Iranian-Israeli conflict. So at the time, of course, once in a while, Netanyahu pops up and Netanyahu is talking about how we need to bomb Iran and he needs bunker busters from the Americans to finish the job. Of course, Obama is pushing back at the time. You start going into the history about how Netanyahu has been pushing for a strike on Iran all the way back to the early 90s when he joined official politics and when he gets elected for the first time as prime minister, I believe in 1996. And Iran was always on his target. And as a 75-year-old now, I think it had reached a point where after having taken out Hezbollah and Hamas, attacking Hamas in Gaza, of course, triggering a genocidal campaign, let's call it by its name, what it actually is. And so we are in this particular stage as international relations and diplomacy students. And you are seeing all these events happening. And I remember one of my lecturers at the time, if I'm not wrong, even mentioned that we were joining the course, the undergrad course, at a very opportune time for like international relations students. I mean, it's like so many international events were happening in that particular period. And well, it might not be very unique. Maybe I'm a little bit nostalgic, but I'm also imagining students who are joining that particular course in the year 2 or 3 or 2002 when the US was ratcheting up the propaganda about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and they wanted to invade Iraq. It will have been a similar thing. Maybe students who are taking that course somewhere around the world. So for me, it's in Nairobi, Kenya, in East Africa, who are taking that course maybe 1989, 1990, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the closing down of the curtains of communism and the Soviet Union, or the early 90s, 92, 93, when the Yugoslavian war is breaking up. Maybe for somebody taking that course in Europe, you are having all these rapid geopolitical events. I think those are some of the key ones I could mention. Of course, for, let's say, 94, 95, the Rwandan genocide, or maybe 99, the Western NATO bombing campaign in Serbia and Kosovo. So these are some of the key flashpoints in geopolitical terms. Pretty much the same way, I don't know, for students of economics, international economics, stuff like that. Maybe the 2008 financial crash was something very big. Maybe the dot-com crash in 99, 2000 were really major topics for them. So for us, I think with the Arab Spring happening and then all the violent history of the Middle East coming into sharp focus, it really became interesting for us, and we were digging into the Israelis and the Iranians. Can the Israelis actually manage an attack on the Iranians without heavy repercussions? And to be honest, I think the war that most of us over that decade thought will never come to take place actually happened about 1.5 weeks ago, on June 13th, when the Israelis launched a massive airstrike campaign, not only on Iranian nuclear facilities in Isfahan, in Natanz, Fordo. Probably they didn't hit Fordo at the beginning. I'm really not sure about that. As well as Pachin and Arak and many other locations in even Bushehr, I think, the civilian nuclear facility for electricity generation. And of course, it also goes without saying that they attacked so many of the leading IRGC commanders, the commanders of the Quds Force, IRGC, as well as even the Basij. If I look back to that period of time, I think these are war that many of us somehow followed through for a very long time. And I remember, a year into my undergrad, you will read, I used to be a huge fan of Daily Mail, now I know. That's a red flag of sorts with the tabloid journalism that they do. But they used to post so many detailed stories about how Israel used to take out, let's say, some of these Iranian scientists, nuclear scientists. And at the time, I think they had taken out, the campaign started in 2009, if I'm not wrong, and went until 2013, 2014. At the time, they had taken out 5 to 6 scientists. And unfortunately, I think one was even a wrestler or something of the sort. He was even not a nuclear scientist. And Daily Mail used to post the stories about how Israeli, probably Mossad agents, riding a motorbike in Tehran, they planted a magnetic bomb on the car during rush hour, and then they disappeared in the rush hour traffic, and they were not able to be followed. And so those stories were fascinating, not in a very good way, but in terms of adding to your knowledge base about what is actually happening and how the Israeli government, at the time Netanyahu was prime minister, he was back again, I think, after Ehud Olmert had resigned some time back. There was an election and Netanyahu came back the second time. These were really interesting developments for most of us, and we will follow them very keenly. And so I remember at the time we were also talking about the Israeli attack on the Osirak nuclear facility in Iraq. And I think that was back in 1981. And I remember one of the discussions we were having at the time was that the Israelis had used F-15s to actually carry out that attack. And Kenya, at the time, that was 30 years later, our fighter jets were like the F-5s or something of the sort. And so we were like, Israel had F-15s back in 1981. Now, of course, we can understand that these were some of the ammunition that they were given by America. And especially this was on the back of the Camp David treaties. And I remember it was also around the same time that I read something about Israel apparently having threatened Pakistan, because if again you can remember that history between Pakistan and India, I think both countries did their nuclear tests sometime in 98 within a very short window of time, I think 1 month or weeks between one country doing their nuclear test and announcing to the world that they were a nuclear power, and the other country was doing the same. What I had read at the time was that, remember, it was Netanyahu 1.0, because it was in 98 and Netanyahu had come to power in 96 to 99. And he had actually contemplated launching an airstrike on the Pakistani nuclear facility in Kahuta. And so the conversation at the time was, the Pakistanis had issued a very stern warning to Israel, and they had said that if you hit Kahuta, we'll hit Dimona. Pakistan is far much away. With Tehran, it's about 1,500 kilometers away from Israel. And for Pakistan, you have to go much further, probably 2,500 kilometers away. And so Israeli fighter jets would have required to refuel somewhere. And the story goes, I don't know how true it was that they had asked India if they could refuel their fighter jets in India before going back home. And the Indians considered it to be a very risky affair, one that might actually lead to a much broader conflict between India and Pakistan themselves. And so without the approval of the Indians to refuel their fighter jets on Indian territory, the Israelis, actually under Netanyahu, Milekovsky 1.0, abandoned the plan. But so it goes back to this Menachem Begin, his doctrine, the Begin doctrine, that no Muslim country actually should be able to get nuclear weapons on their hands, because the very thought of a Muslim country supporting the Palestinians having nuclear weapons is that they will be able to threaten Israel with those nuclear weapons. And it's also the time, I think, from an international perspective, you are getting to realize how even other global leaders were dealing with Israel, and how they even viewed Netanyahu personally. Because I remember there was this, I think 2014, 2015 maybe, this hot mic moment where the French president Nicolas Sarkozy and Barack Obama were speaking. I think it was in France, and they were speaking about Netanyahu. And Sarkozy was just like, I can't stand the guy. He lies way too much. Now referring to Netanyahu, real name Milekovsky. And Obama retorted by actually saying, like, at least for you don't have to deal with him every single day. Like, for me, it's a daily uphill battle. And so if I remember that particular time and such kind of conversations, and of course, it's not the first time many international leaders have called Benjamin Milekovsky to be a serial or a pathological liar. Because I think even the current French president, Emmanuel Macron, I think earlier this year or sometime last year also said something similar about Netanyahu always lying. So of course he's a massive warmonger, that is well known. His record on that particular issue cannot be denied. I think the conflict coming to take place right now really takes me back to those days when you were studying international relations in general, comparative foreign policy, international relations in Africa, but also outside of Africa. We were looking at a lot of the historical perspectives that shaped, let's say, the Cold War. So for the Middle East, that will have been the Six-Day War, 1967, and the Yom Kippur War, or the Arab-Israeli conflict of 1973, the oil shocks that came out of that. And I think one of the things I used to remember when you were going through the Cold War history that was always quite remarkable, once again in a very negative way, is that the Middle East had almost experienced, every decade they had almost interstate major wars. So they were not like civil wars in within. They had the civil wars like in a place like Lebanon, for instance. But we are talking about interstate wars. Like the Middle East has had them, let's say since 1945, at the end of World War II, they've had them pretty much every single decade. In the 48, the Nakba itself. In the 50s, you had the Suez War and things were building up. In the 60s, to close the decade, of course, you had the 1967 Six-Day War. In the 70s, you had the Yom Kippur War, and then later, towards the end of the decade, you had the Iraqi-Iranian War breakout, and that pretty much captured the entire of the 80s decade. And then at the beginning of the 90s decade, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and then Gulf War erupts. And then starting with the 2000s decade, you had the second Gulf War with the propagandized and the false narrative of weapons of mass destruction possessed by Saddam, which was a very huge hoax. And then after the Iraqi war, at the beginning of the 2010s, when I'm now starting my undergrad, now you have the Arab uprising, and which reverberates for virtually over a decade in a place like Syria, which culminated with al-Julani coming to power last year in December. A lot of people have already made mention to the parallels that you can draw between, let's say, the role of the media when it came to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, 2002, all the way to 2003 when the invasion actually happened in, I think, March of 2003. And the role the media actually played in terms of fueling that war and actually pushing the narrative of weapons of mass destruction, which was really shameful, to be honest. And we've already seen it with this current Israeli attack on Iran. We've seen a lot of Western media especially pushing the narrative quite strongly about how they were actually taking the Benjamin Mileikovsky Netanyahu narrative that Iran is only a few weeks away from a bomb. There were so many memes even online, people saying like Netanyahu was saying the same thing all the way back from the early 90s, 92, 93. And there was even somebody who posted a joke on a YouTube comment section on one of the videos I was watching, and he was like, if you read the Torah from 400 BC to 350 BC, somewhere there's a passage that mentions that Iran will have a nuclear bomb within the next 2-3 years, or something of the sort. You can understand how this Netanyahu-Mileikovsky narrative actually got picked up by Western media, and they've been pushing it. I mean, channels like Fox, Jesus, the warmongering has been so hot. You have to love Al Jazeera, like the work they're doing, and most Western media. I'm a huge fan of BBC Radio. I've listened to BBC Radio for like 15 to 20 years right now. But of course on the TV side, you can see like the way they pursue narratives. It's a very Western-oriented narrative. And talk about American liberal media. I mean, your CNNs, MSNBCs, and the entire gamut of Western liberal media. I mean, they're on an entirely different level in terms of, let's say, lapping up the narrative that the Israeli government has been giving to them, especially when it comes to the issue of Iran. And not only Iran, but also we've seen it with the genocide in Gaza and the apartheid in the occupied West Bank territories. The warmongering has been happening almost at a similar fashion with what we had in the 2002-2003 period with Iraq. So I think this particular journey, from my own view as somebody who studied international relations and diplomacy from Nairobi, Kenya, I think it has been really interesting, like things we were talking about and hypothesizing and theorizing in class, and we were like, this war will never come to take place. And unfortunately, it has taken place. It has really been, I think the Iranians have really suffered a lot in terms of the military capacity that has been taken out. However, I think it has also been really impressive how they've been pushing back and hitting back with missiles in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, in Beersheba, and in so many other places. Because even back then we used to talk about the Iron Dome and how it's perfect, how it helped in, let's say, the 2008 Gaza war, in the 2011 Gaza war, in the 2014 war, in the 2019 war, and stuff like that. So, of course, I remember when we were talking about it, it was the period between 2011 and 2014, because that's when I graduated. And we talk about the Iron Dome and all these missiles that both sides had. Iran used to hold military parades, and they would showcase some of their ballistic missiles. And seeing how Iran has been firing the salvo of missiles, of course, it has been going down day by day. And from an article I read somewhere, it's like they're preserving some of the missiles. It has been estimated that they have 2,000 ballistic missiles, and they have fired about 400 into Israel. Israel is also claiming that they have taken out another 400 missiles, which means their stocks of ballistic missiles have been reduced by almost half. And so that's why some people are saying from the first days of the war, the Iranian salvo of missiles has been going down. And of course, they have always been pursuing an asymmetric strategy. They're not only firing ballistic missiles, they're also firing drones, so that they try to saturate the Iron Dome and the Arrow interceptors in Israel. And of course, the war has been quite costly. So watching Al Jazeera the other day, there was a mention that, I don't know, from the chief of staff of Netanyahu Mileikovsky, that Israel spent 1.45 billion US dollars on the first 2 nights to defend against Iranian missiles. And that's only what Israel spent. So we don't know how much the Americans and the British, who have been helping to shoot down some of those missiles, have also spent, which brings it down to about 700 million USD every single day. And I've also seen a figure, for instance, that one of the Arrow interceptors, I think it's the Arrow 3 interceptors, costs about 3 million USD. One single interceptor missile. And so you start to see the war economics, basically, how much Israel has spent. And that is on top of, I think, 85 billion USD that Israel spent in the Gaza war up till the end of 2024. So last year in December, they had spent a whopping $85 billion. So the amount of money spent on the Israeli side is a lot, but also on the Iranian side, because they have been under sanctions. They have been producing, I think, 400,000 barrels of oil per day, down from their peak of, I think, 2019, when they were producing 1.5 million barrels. By the first week of the war, that has come down to only 100,000 barrels per day. And of course, the majority of that is going to China, ostensibly at a very huge discount. So I think the war has been really costly. That will be my African perspective, going back to the history of how like I was drawn to this particular subject starting my undergrad back in 2011. The Duku, Stuxnet, and people like AQ Khan, the entire Arab Spring, as well as far much later the assassination of Haj Qasim Soleimani in 2020 in January, and now the conflict that is actually ongoing. And of course, speaking about the media, and especially Western media, now they've covered this particular topic. I think with YouTube, we've also seen a lot of the new YouTube media, so to speak, covering this particular topic in a very different way, which has also been quite remarkable, to be honest. Like some of the channels I usually watch, people like Media Sun on Zitio, Novara Media with Michael Walker and the team there, Ash Sakar and everybody. Breaking Points, even a character as interesting as George Galloway. I always love me some George Galloway. I'll just be honest about that. Like I always find the guy quite interesting. He always has quite sharp insights, especially on the Palestinian conflict. He has been accused of anti-Semitism and stuff like that. And of course, he has always countered, talking about the people he has worked with in the past, including Jews, people like Joe Slovo during apartheid in South Africa, and so many things. So George Galloway, I think I've been watching a lot of him. I also found a little bit of dalliance only in terms of the warmongering and stopping the warmongering in the US with people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and even Steve Bannon, people who honestly I've never had one iota of agreement with their political philosophies, with their views on so many things. But I think when it comes to the push that they had to stop, let's say, the US getting involved in that particular war, especially Tucker, that podcast that he did with Steve Bannon, and even someone like Candace. I mean, Candace on Gaza, that's when we saw that she had thought things through and saw that what was happening in Gaza was basically a genocide, and I think she was very right on that. And also we've seen her push back against Iran. And so it's not that there is a uniformity of ideas or something of the sort, but I think their pushback on this particular Israeli aggression on the Iranians has been quite remarkable, to be honest. They were very brilliant coverage. People like Dave Smith also. Yeah, so those are my musings about the geopolitical impact of the Israeli-Iran war that is currently ongoing, and my own maybe little experience with the entire topic going back, I think 15 years now, because 2011 was maybe 15 years back. It has been a journey. It has been a war that I never thought could happen, but it did happen. And let's see how the next weeks and months maybe actually play out in terms of this once in a generational event where the Israelis attacked, and then they were joined later by the Americans in attacking the nuclear facilities of the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's a wrap for this particular video on geopolitics. Kindly consider subscribing to this channel, hit the like button and the thumbs up button. Be sure to wait for similar videos discussing geopolitics and international relations related topics affecting the African continent, but specifically the Horn of Africa, East African region. I'll see you in the next video. That's a wrap from me here from Nairobi, Kenya. Bye bye.